Many of you watching this video will compose your photographs based around a set of rules. The rule of thirds, the rule of odds, leading lines, negative space, frames within frames, the list goes on. But the truth is, not all of these rules work for every single photograph that we make. So how do we make the decision about the best one for the job? Today I've come to the bleak but beautiful bar house on Grassington Moor in the Yorkshire Dales, where I'm going to introduce you to a three-step thought process that will help you to bypass these rules altogether and make excellent compositional decisions for yourself. Before I introduce you to this three-step process, I just want to show you an example of how following the rules doesn't necessarily work all of the time. Take this framing that we've got here. We're ticking a lot of those compositional boxes. We've got this wall which is acting as a leading line, taking us in towards the barn, which is our main focal point. We've got these thistles, which is acting as foreground interest, and a visual stepping stone, taking our vision further back into the frame. If you look at the buildings behind me, we've got 3 windows on the barn and 2 chimneys on the top of the building, so we're ticking that rule of odds box. And we're also ticking the rule of thirds box as well. We've got the wall taking us in on the left-hand third, the building ending on the right-hand third. The building's also positioned on that top third, with the thistles in the foreground here on the bottom third. So everything points to this photograph being absolutely spot on. But personally, I just don't think it is. I think it's a boring shot. We've got too much greenery, we've got too much wall on our left-hand side. So the rules, although they're there, are not necessarily working for us in this particular circumstance. So it's here where our three-step thought process comes in, where we're going to bypass those rules by looking at our composition visually rather than formulaically. So let's take into account this second composition and look at our first step in this process, which is subject. Namely, is my subject or subjects interesting? You can have the best compositional setup in the world, but if your subject isn't going to draw people's attention, then nobody's going to look at your photograph. Just like in the first composition that we looked at, the bar house is the main subject within our frame here. But I'm hoping that you can see that in this second composition, it just looks more interesting than it did in the first. Instead of just being a flat stone wall running along the horizon line, we've come down to a lower level, projecting it higher up in the frame, and also coming at an angle, so we're creating all of these different directional lines within the frame that not only help our subject matter to stand out, but they also compel us to look at it for longer. In this composition, we're also making use of what I like to call secondary or supporting subjects. These are subjects that aren't as important as the main one that we want people's eye to be drawn to, but they can support it. They can make it stand out in the frame more. They can provide maybe a little bit of context or a bit of a backstory to the main subject. So here we've got this decaying wall, which provides context of abandonment of the farm buildings behind, and also acts as a bit of foreground interest. Up here, if I try not to get stung by all the nettles on the way, we've got this bath in an outhouse, which is filling the midground of the photograph and making us linger a little bit in this area before we make our way to the main subject matter. It's also providing that extra context as well. So with any photograph that we make, when it comes to subject matter, we first of all have to think, is our subject interesting? But then we can utilise other things around the area of that subject to keep the eye within the frame and provide a bit more interest, so it keeps our attention on the photograph for a longer period of time. The second step in this three-step thought process surrounds height, depth and layering. We've found an interesting subject, now we need to make it stand out, and these three things will help us to do that. So let's first of all talk about depth. What we need to do is differentiate between foreground, midground and background. So the wall here is providing us with foreground interest, but then we've got this neat little dip in it here. So beyond that dip we can see the greenery of the nettles. That's separating that foreground and leading us into the midground where we find the outhouse and the bath. And then we've got another little gap between there and the buildings behind. When it comes to creating those layers of depth, we have to think about contrast and colour. So trying to make those separate within those layers, we're in danger of coming a cropper a little bit if we look at this bit of wall behind me here. This wall is very similar in colour and tone to the bar house behind, but because we've got this bright white bit of lichen on the top here, that colour contrast and tonal contrast is pulling it forward in the frame. It's separating out those layers. We now need to talk about height. Now remember, for this composition I said that we came down to a slightly lower angle. Well, that's for a very good reason. What it does is it projects our subject matter above the horizon line, the bit where the land meets the sky. And what that's doing is it's adding another layer of depth and interest to our photograph. It's filling the sky and giving us something to look at from foreground through midground to background. And also notice that where the angle of the roofs of the buildings behind me here intersect, they're all separated from each other with a bit of sky. What this does is it provides a bit more layering, it provides a bit more interest, but it also separates out each element of the photograph. So instead of our eye going straight through to the bar house and just settling there and thinking, this isn't very interesting, it's got little bits to settle on along the way. It's slowing our eye down. It's adding to that compositional value of our photograph. So we've found an interesting subject and we've made it stand out using height, depth and layering. So we can now move on to our third step in this three-step thought process, which is all about how we keep people's attention within the frame of the photograph. What we don't want people to do is just look at our subject, think, yeah, that's quite interesting, but I think I'm going to move on and look at something else now. And equally, we don't want people to leave our frame too soon. I've seen people use really strong leading lines in the past that are almost too strong, so they take us into the photograph, but take us out of it as well, which we don't want them to do. With the prominence of the rule of thirds in photography composition, many people are led to believe that good composition means that you're drawing people's eye to one side of the photograph or the other, or to the top or bottom. But this isn't the case. One of the best ways to keep people's attention within the frame of your photograph is to draw them to the middle. And we can do that by using visualized shapes. Visualized shapes are shapes that formulate the structure of your photograph but aren't necessarily complete. But when the brain sees them, it automatically mentally completes them itself. Let's take one last look at the composition behind me to see exactly how this plays out. Bear with me as I run back into the frame. What we're working with here is a triangle and a circle. You may not see it before I point it out, but hopefully you will do once I have done. So first of all, the triangle is formed by the apex of the outhouse roof here, all the way up to the top of the bar house and back down beyond the porch on the right hand side of the photograph. Our circle is formed by this dip in the wall. Although we can only see the semicircle at the bottom, our brain completes the circuit above as well, so it automatically frames the bath on this side of the photograph. all of those lines are converging at this neat little point here, at the top of the wall, which is around the central area of the picture. By constantly bringing people's eye and attention back to this point in the photograph, we're not letting their eyes leave. They're not following a line out to the side or getting put off by an imbalanced photograph where there might be something more important in the foreground than there is in the background. It's all neatly balanced, and that is ultimately the crux of composition. In a moment I'm going to share with you the photographs that I've taken here at the bar house today. As you look at them, I'd like you to pay close attention to the subject matter that I've chosen, where I've positioned it within the frame, how I've used height, depth and layers to separate it out, and how visualised shapes can draw your eye in and keep your attention within the frame. Feel free to pause it on each photograph if you wish to have a closer look. As the photographs scroll through, you might think, hang on a minute Tom, I can see evidence of the rule of thirds, leading lines, the rule of odds. Weren't we meant to be ignoring all of these compositional rules? No, we weren't meant to be ignoring them, we were meant to be bypassing them. I'm not saying that compositional rules are a bad thing. If you remember at the start of the video, I said that compositional rules apply, but for different sorts of photographs at different times. What our three-step thought process does is it bypasses those rules. If we see them, we're almost coming back round to them as a happy accident. We're not formulating our photographs around them. What we're doing is we're making visual decisions for ourselves. And for me, that's much more productive when we're composing photographs.